Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Well, hey guys, I am here today with Mark Miller, and Mark Miller is a Wall Street Journal best-selling author. But probably, Mark, I think what you're best known for is your work with Chick-fil-A, 45 years at Chick-fil-A. And so thank you for joining us here with the Advantage Podcast. Appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and I actually came across Mark, I want to say about 20 years ago. There was an organization in Dallas called the Leadership Network, very influential for us at LCBC Church. And Mark, I think you were just talking probably leadership back then,
That's what
20
I
some
that's
years
what I
ago.
tend to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, so appreciated that very much. And the guys that are part of the Advantage know Andy Martin, and Andy 20 years ago was a part of our creative team at LCBC, and he said he learned from you the art of streaming, which was he thought it was an art. We all thought it was a painful experience where we just had to spend time writing on a yellow pad
Yeah.
creative ideas, and it ended up being very productive, but it was painful.
Good.
So,
Good. Well, and I told Andy, he may have forgotten this, that there are many, many techniques, but he may not have shared that with you because he liked that one, I guess.
I think he liked that one best. Yeah. So, Mark, thank you for taking time with us. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir.
So, I know you've done a lot of writing. I think 12 books you've written. You even started a consulting firm for just leaders and working with leaders around the world. So, you just have wealth of experience when it comes to leadership. But I would love, again, realizing you're talking to pastors of the largest churches in Pennsylvania. And so, would love to talk about just your experiences at Chick-fil-A because if I understand right, you started kind of at the bottom and you worked your way all the way up. So give us a little history of your time there at Chick-fil-A.
All right. Well, I'll turn the clock way back. I actually started as an hourly team member in one of the restaurants, but I was awful.
Is that
Uh,
right?
it's really too soon to talk about it, but I'll answer your question. Um, yeah, I just wasn't good with my hands. I mean, still to
Mm.
this day, I'm not, which made me slow. And if you're slow in a quick service restaurant, you're in trouble. And so after about 6 months, I made what I call a strategic career decision. I quit. Now, here's the logic, and I chalked this up to the mind of a child because this was a long, long time ago. I said it would be better to leave than to have to explain for the rest of my life why I got fired at Chick-fil-A. And so I left and I went and got another job. And 6 months later, I got laid off. And I thought, shoot, I need a job. And I can't do what they do in the restaurants, but they seem like nice people. So I had the bright idea to go to the corporate headquarters. Again, I know that doesn't make sense in any universe, but again, just a child. So I went to the corporate headquarters and walked in and told the receptionist I wanted a job working in their warehouse. I knew they had a warehouse.
And how old were you at this point? I mean, is this still in high school, post
I
high
was
school?
18, I
Okay.
guess. I had
Yeah.
just gotten out of high school and was going to a local junior college. I was going to do that at night, so I felt like I needed a job. And she told me to have a seat, which I thought was a really good sign that she didn't call security. Now, I learned later they didn't have security, but nonetheless, she told me to have a seat. And just a few minutes later, Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, came out, took me into his office to conduct this interview. That made no sense to me. I knew who the man was, right? He's the guy who invented the chicken sandwich. I'm sitting there thinking, why is he interviewing a kid to work in the warehouse? And I later learned, I didn't know that day, but he only had 15 employees. And if you've only got 15 employees, it probably makes a little bit of sense for the head man or the head woman to be conducting those interviews. And we had a
Exactly.
very short, as I recall, a very short and cordial conversation. And I tell people to this day, I think it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job working in the warehouse. And that was in 1978.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So obviously your trajectory went up from there, but let me pause for just a second and ask you, Mark. So pastors are always looking for talent and they're always looking for leaders in their congregation. And it's fascinating to me to hear, and as you explain where you rose to, but where you started, and realizing that we as pastors, as leaders, have people in our churches like you as an 18, 19-year-old starting out. How do we identify what are there characteristics you look for? And if you were there for from the 15 employees on, then you had to
Right.
be involved in many roles. So maybe I'd ask you that first, but then love for you to talk about how do we even identify people like yourself?
All right. So let's pick up the story and I'll
Yeah.
come to
Okay.
your answer because I would not have had a clue back then.
Yeah.
Do have some thoughts on that now, but my career, as you said, what you said went up from there. I would say I made lots of twists and turns, but I got to start things, and I
Mm,
think it didn't have anything to do with my talent necessarily. I think it was let the kid do it, let the kid do it. So I started corporate communications when I was 19. Uh,
wow.
and then I ended up starting the quality and customer satisfaction group. And I served in restaurant operations and led the training group and started the leadership development practice, the organizational effectiveness practice. And so I really had trouble holding down a job all those years, but continued to move throughout and around the organization for a long, long time. And certainly thankful for the opportunity. To your question specifically, that's a question that Chick-fil-A operators wanted to know because the human resources people has spent my adult life convincing me and reminding me that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Mm,
However, the operators challenged that. And they said, well, that makes perfect sense if you're dealing with an adult. You can look for clues in their work history that will give you an indication of how they'll perform in the future. They said, what do you look for in young people who've
mm,
not yet had real world work experience?
yeah.
And I don't know that Truett processed it near this deeply. Truett was one of the most intuitive folks, and honestly, I think he needed somebody to work in the warehouse. So I don't think he was even thinking about me
He
as a
wasn't
future
thinking
leader.
beyond the warehouse.
I don't think he was, but
Yeah.
we'll give him credit for that. Um, so we challenged our restaurant operators decades ago that they needed to look to leadership character. We think leadership looks a lot like an iceberg. You've got the 10% above the waterline, which represents the skills, and the 90% below, which represents the heart or character of the individual.
Mm,
And those skills typically will form later in life and they're learned often over the course of a career. But those leadership character traits, those heart habits, we believe begin to form well before someone moves into the workplace.
mm,
And so we challenge them when you're trying to evaluate specifically a young person. By the way, this works with adults too, but with young people, you can look for several heart habits. I'll rattle them off pretty quick, and if
that'd be
you
right. Yeah.
want to chase one of them, we can. First is you look for a hunger for wisdom.
Mm,
The best leaders are learners, always have been, always will be. Now they approach it many, many different ways, but they've got this insatiable desire to learn and grow. So you look
mm,
for that hunger for wisdom. The best leaders expect the best. They have an optimistic spirit.
mm,
I have not yet met a highly successful pessimistic leader
mm,
because we're
mm,
dealers in hope. And if you're not,
yeah.
if you're optimistic, you can be an effective dealer in hope. And if you're
Yeah.
pessimistic, who wants to follow that?
Right.
Right? They accept responsibility. The
Mm,
best leaders don't blame people. They know if it happens on their watch, it's their responsibility.
mm,
They respond with courage. Virtually everything you and I do as leaders requires some courage, maybe a little
mm,
bit, maybe a lot.
mm,
And they have a courageous spirit in the
mm,
face of challenge, in the face of opportunity, in the face of adversity. They're willing to act. And then
mm,
fifth, and finally, is they think others first.
mm, mm,
And that's not the way the world works. I don't think
yeah.
that's the way we work in our human natural abilities, but I think you can cultivate the ability to think others first. And if you can find several of those, maybe not even all of them in a young person, then I think you've got a lot to work with.
So I love those 5 things, Mark, but talk to me a little bit then about if Truett had 15 people on his staff, it's not like he had opportunity to say, let's take a chance on 5 young people and hope one of them works out. And to your point, he may have just been trying to fill a warehouse position and that was it. But as pastors, if you've got a staff of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, you don't have a whole lot of money to take chances on people. So how do you even How do you find that out first? Are you looking for volunteers in a church setting first? And if you see those traits, then you hire? Or what kind of advice can you give to find that person?
Yeah, huge question. We probably don't want to spend the whole hour on this, so let me just give you a couple of thoughts. I think your greatest asset in that scenario, it is a combination. If you're dealing with an adult, past performance is the best indicator of future performance. That's not to say
Okay.
that people can't learn and grow. It's not to say that people can't change. But if you want someone to lead your finance team and or some other highly detailed oriented deal, and they have an incomplete application or errors on their application or they show up late, those are clues, right? So
Yeah.
I still
Yeah.
go back to with adults, the best predictor of future performance is past performance.
Okay.
Secondly, it's behaviorally based interview questions. And I'm not great at it, but I didn't have to be because much of our interviewing was done by our human resources department. Now,
Mm.
we all had to learn enough because we were involved in the process, but these hypothetical and theoretical questions, what might you do if you ever encountered XYZ? If they've got a 2-digit IQ, they can probably guess the right answer,
Yeah.
as opposed to tell me about a time when, what did you do? What happened? How did you respond?
Mm. Mm.
Behavioral based questions is as long as the person you're interviewing has integrity, their answers are going to tell you a whole lot.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So then maybe another line of questioning, same track though. Um, One of the things I saw at LCBC Church, where I pastored for 32 years, Mark, was early days. I was grabbing anybody I could find, and I would hope that they had the ability, and then we kind of move forward. Once we got established, one of the things that I watched happen in our church is that we would have great young people coming up in the ranks. All the positions were already filled by older people. And when I say older, it could have been 30 or 40 or 50-year
Sure.
olds. And
Mhm.
so I would watch young people that I thought, man, this person could be a star. And they would go to the church down the street and join their staff because they were hungry and hurting for any kind of leader they could get. Where in our system, you had to be further along before we could get them into our system. And so I'm sure that happened at Chick-fil-A too. If you were there 45 years and after 45 years, I don't even know what your staff would be there now, but thousands and thousands, I'm sure. And so how
Right.
do you get somebody that has promise, but you don't really have a position for them? What did you do as an organization to fit young leaders in like that?
Okay. Well, I heard a couple things there. Let me talk first to the church. I had a chance recently, it's a little over a year ago, I guess, to speak to a bunch of executive pastors. I do that, as you know, from time to time.
Yeah.
And the parting question I thought was interesting, and I don't know that this is right, but they asked for my opinion. They said, "What's the biggest opportunity facing large churches?" And I said, "Well, I think it's a missed opportunity. And
Mm.
I think it's the talent sitting in your pews.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of men and women who would volunteer to serve you and to assist you and to help you.
Mm.
People with tremendous talent. I wouldn't even necessarily put myself in that category, but I lived that firsthand when I served on the senior staff of a large church as a volunteer for
Mm.
years
Mm.
in their staff meetings. I mean,
Mm.
I was responsible for half the ministries as a volunteer.
Mm.
So I think there's a huge opportunity, whether those people be young or old.
Mm. Good.
So I think it's a big opportunity. Now, as it relates to staff, there's not going to be a place for everybody. And if they go work somewhere else, I guess we'll just say, yay, God, the kingdom is
Yeah.
being boosted and being strengthened. Um, but I mean, here's what we tell people on our staff. You control your readiness. The organization controls your opportunity.
Okay.
And we literally have had people who had more potential than their current role, but the organization didn't need because there's a
Yeah.
structural need, right? And
Yeah.
and when all those structural places are filled,
Yeah.
then you can find other ways to give those people more opportunity and more responsibility and projects and problems to solve. I mean, you can give them good work to do, but you may not be able to give them that next promotion. Now, one quick sidebar. I'm not sure if this would be applicable to the folks that you're that are listening to this, but name and face comes to mind. I had a member on my team years ago who wanted a promotion. Talented guy, he wanted the next job up, and there were no openings. I mean, those jobs were filled. But he was in a job, he was in a good job, and he was doing good work. And he came to me and he said, "I've got more capacity than this role requires." And I said, "Fantastic." He said, "Well, why is that fantastic?" I said, "Well, you've got a real opportunity." He said, "What's my opportunity?" I said, "Try to figure out what God wants you to do with that extra capacity." And he ended up being the volunteer leader of a
Mhm.
global missions organization.
So the opportunity you were challenging him to take is outside of
But he
Chick-fil-A or
kept
your
his day
organization.
job. No, he
Yeah,
kept his
yeah,
day job
exactly. Yeah,
because you're telling me you've got more capacity. I kind of thought he had more capacity. There just
yeah,
wasn't a spot for him to move up.
yeah,
And so he went out and did a whole bunch of kingdom work and
yeah.
continued to draw a paycheck for years from the chicken.
Yeah, no, that's good. Can I go back to your comment of you ran staff meetings for your church as a volunteer? So I think one of the things you're totally correct in that we miss out on opportunities to have very talented people in our churches help us lead. I think sometimes the fear, Mark, is you may if I bring you in as a volunteer, and I don't know how many hours you were giving to the organization, the church that you were a part of, do you, I would worry, do you know enough about the organization to truly lead us well? I can think of all kinds of reasons not to do it, but can you give us some reasons why it's worth taking a risk on somebody like yourself to have very important roles? Because what we tend to do is, again, ask you to hand out bulletins or work in the parking lot when you've got so many more abilities than that. And so we, again, miss opportunities.
Yeah. I don't know that I've got a great answer to your question.
Or let me ask you this, why did they take a risk on you there in your church? Obviously, they
Well,
knew you well, right? So
no, they didn't know me well. So
okay,
what
interesting.
happened was my wife and I were going to change churches. It's a long, long story. We
Okay.
had only well, we had never changed churches, and I had only changed churches once before that in my life.
Hmm.
So I didn't know how to change churches.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go meet with the pastor and just introduce myself and kind of get inside his head just a little bit. And I had been doing some modestly significant leadership work in my previous church, nothing to the scale that we just described, but
Yeah.
I was leading, um, yeah, pretty large group of volunteers at the
Okay.
old church. And so I walked in and got to know, talking with the pastor, and he said, "So what questions do you have?" And I said, "I really think I've only got one." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Have you got something I can do to serve?" And he pulled out his journal and he flipped back, flipped back, flipped back. He said, "Okay, this was 2 years ago. This is when I started asking God to give us somebody like you on our team."
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
maybe a unique circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was leading men's ministry, women's ministry, discipleship ministry, small group ministry, assimilation ministry, staff meetings, and I may have missed something. Writing curriculum. I wrote curriculum for a couple of years for the small groups as well.
So how
So
much time were you giving to the church at that point?
probably peaked at around 30 hours a week.
A week.
Yeah.
Still working full time in your
Still
job.
working full time at the chicken. And he asked me if I would be the executive pastor. I said, as a volunteer. And he said, yeah. And I went, no, because he wanted all the staff to report to me. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. But I did that for about probably 4 years.
So you almost were the executive pastor
I
anyway.
sort
But
of was. I sort
yeah,
of
so
was.
if I would just listen to what you're saying, Mark, I think that so often we miss opportunities and we don't think creatively as to what somebody like yourself could do. And so obviously the pastor had been praying about this, looking for somebody, maybe realized a deficiency in himself or a deficiency in his team. And
Well, maybe it's an opportunity because let me tell you what happened. I went to him 2 years into this and I said, I think what you need is an executive pastor because I'm doing some of it, but there's more I can't do. And all these people
yeah,
are still reporting to you and so forth. And, and he agreed. And it was actually my departure that nudged him to start looking for an
yeah,
executive
okay.
pastor. and they've had an executive pastor now for 15 years.
Yeah. Wow.
They needed
That's kind
one
of,
for 20 years.
yeah.
So that's actually what happened in that particular case.
Yeah. So bottom line, we just need to think more creatively, be more wide open as to what possibilities exist. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit, Mark, of just culture of the organization? So culture was a big thing for you, still is a big thing,
Mhm.
but at Chick-fil-A, and even as your organization now, I think is called Lead Every Day. And I'm sure that you're working with leaders in how do you create culture within the organization? How do you change culture? So what kind of things are you talking about when it comes to culture?
Well, let me give you just a little backstory. This is one of the projects that Chick-fil-A commissioned several years ago. As strong as the Chick-fil-A culture is, we're very thankful for that. The restaurant operators, the staff, their leaders, everybody works on it. But we wanted the culture to be stronger. And we were hearing more and more people talking about the culture. And we heard a lot of leaders talking about the challenges they were facing. And they might not use the word culture, but you only had to pull back one level and realize it was a culture issue. So we actually did some work 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and did a global study because we wanted to figure out what's universally true about organizational culture so that we could bring that content back to Chick-fil-A. We spent 3.5 days at our annual meeting 2 years ago unpacking what I'm about to give you in
Mm,
90 seconds
okay.
because we went around the world and said what is universally true about this. Um, Give you two stats, and then I'll answer your question
Yeah.
directly.
Okay.
The first stat that caught our attention was that 72% of US leaders, 67% globally, said culture is the most powerful tool at their disposal to drive performance.
Mm,
Now, I
mm,
don't know if that strikes you as high, low, or whatever. We found it interesting, but not particularly actionable. We said, okay, 7 out of 10 leaders think culture is like the number one driver of performance, which most leaders I know about know care about performance. So it's like, well, then, okay, that's probably a good starting
we gotta
point.
look at this. Yeah.
We're not going to have to convince them it's important. The next question stopped us in our tracks. We asked those same global leaders to rank their priorities. Building and maintaining culture for US leaders came in at number 12.
Mm, mm,
Here's the deal. I'm not working on my 12th priority, and you're not either, and nobody else is, which is why culture is in such a mess around the world in organizations is leaders know it's important, but they're not working on it. Now, there are any number of reasons they aren't working on it. That's probably another talk for another day. But the angle we chose to attack is let's be sure they know what to do because a lot of leaders actually don't know how. They have this intuitive, even experiential belief that it's important, but they actually don't know how to create it.
yeah.
And
And
so,
Mark, can I ask you, do you think that most leaders know if the culture is bad or not? You mentioned an intuitive sense that it's important, but do they even know? Do you think most pastors, if they've got a bad culture in their church, would even know they've got a bad culture?
I can't speak to pastors specifically, but corporate leaders, there's about a 40-point gap between what they think and the frontline people think. So you might, and that's globally. So you
Yeah.
might assume there would be a gap in a church that unless
Yeah.
the pastor is working really, really hard to stay in touch, he or she probably doesn't have a firm grip on the reality of the
Yeah.
content or the frontline employees. So
Yeah. Okay.
huge opportunity there. So we came up with 3 culture rules. The first is to aspire. We met so many leaders that had been unable or unwilling to share their hopes and dreams for their culture. And then it would be no surprise that they actually can't create it. Even leaders that would say, "Well, it's clear in my head or it's clear in my heart," and we'd say that's a great place for it to begin, but you realize you can't make it a reality until you rally others to help you pursue it, right? So you
Yeah.
actually have to be able to share that aspiration. Second is
So
yeah.
can you describe what those like what are some characteristics that you'd look for? Or are you getting to that? I don't want to jump ahead of you if you're
No,
going to
no,
get
no,
to
no. I mean, the aspiration, any number of mechanisms, and this is all review for your listeners here. You can use vision or mission or purpose or ethos or values or some combination, but you got to tell people what is it we're actually trying to
Yeah.
build? What is it we're
Yeah.
trying to create? What is it we're trying to become? Which sounds obvious, but I saw a survey from Barna. It's years ago. It said 90% of pastors don't admitted that they don't have a vision for their
Yeah.
congregation in their church. I don't know what those numbers are today. I'm sure your listeners, that's not a problem, but if you can't create what you don't articulate,
Right. Right.
because every organization has a culture. It's either by design or by default.
Right.
And the ones by default are never thriving. They're
Yeah.
never healthy. They're never vibrant. And so you
Yeah.
have to aspire.
Yeah.
Number two, you have to amplify. And this is when you reinforce the aspiration over and over and over again. Different methods, different means, different formats, there's so much noise in the world. You actually have to get above the noise. And this is when people start to believe you. They start to think, oh, he's serious. Oh, she's not changing her mind. That looks like this is going to happen. We better get on board. And again, infinite ways to amplify. The ones we typically talk about is role modeling from senior leaders, storytelling, strategic repetition. I interviewed a leader while we were doing this work from Netflix, and some of your listeners may know that they've got a pretty good reputation. They built the culture they wanted. They've had some marketplace issues, but their culture is exactly what they wanted.
Mhm.
And it's kind of known out in the corporate world, at least, that, yeah, they understand culture really well. So I was interviewing one of the Netflix senior leaders for this project. And I asked him how often he talks about culture. This is under the banner of strategic repetition. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I was wondering if I'd offended him. I didn't know if I'd asked. I mean, like, it was this awkward moment. He's looking at me like I'd lost my mind. And so I'm just sitting there, and he said, "Is your question how often I talk about culture?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, it is." And he said, "Well, every day." He said, "Every leader at Netflix talks about culture every day." He said, "Why wouldn't you?
Mhm.
It's what's most important, asterisk, to drive performance." It's like,
Right.
no, it's our number one thing to drive performance. And so we talk about it all the time. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, purposefully, intentionally, strategically talking about culture every day. That strategic repetition is powerful. Then I talked to a leader. His organization was serving probably 100 countries, and he thought that was a little bit lame. And I'm going, what was that about? And he said, "I talk about culture in every meeting."
Mhm.
I said,
Mhm.
"How do you do that?" He said, "Well, I'm listening to be sure that whatever's being discussed is linked to our aspiration. And if nobody has done that, that's how I close the meeting." He said, "Oh, and if I can't link what we just talked about to our aspiration, I ask people, why were we talking about this?"
Interesting. So it's not so much that he's sitting there saying, let's talk about culture,
Uh-uh.
but he already in his mind has a vision of who they ought to be, who he wants them to be. And if it doesn't match up to that, then he does, again, he's not talking culture. He just says, that's not us. And so we're not
Well,
going
no,
to do
no, no.
that.
But
Or
I
that's
think he is talking culture. I think he's linking the things they're doing to who we're trying to become.
right. But he's not using language of
Yeah.
let's talk about culture. It's just who he is or who she is. And so they constantly go back to that thing.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of oozes out of them all the time without having to
All
say,
the
let's
time.
stop and talk about culture. So
All the time.
yeah, yeah,
Because
that's
it
good.
should all be about culture,
Yeah, that's good.
right?
So, can you give examples then, Mark, of how would a pastor, or it could be any organization you're working with, how do they go about instilling change in their culture if they realize they've got a bad culture and they feel like they've got a vision, they've got an aspiration, something that they're working towards? How would you go about changing it? And the other question I'd ask you, years ago, I heard it said that if you don't like the organization you're leading and you've been there for 7 years or so, then all they're doing is mirroring you. You've been there
Yeah.
long enough that they're just following you. And so I guess it really comes down to changing yourself. But is that
I
even
think
still
that
true?
Well, I think it's generous.
Yeah.
Um, John Maxwell taught me that after 3 years, it's all on you, not 7. After 3 years, it's all on you.
That's
You
worse.
can decide
Wow.
you can decide if you believe that or not. Well, let me share the third rule because you
Yeah.
just teed it up. So the first is to aspire, the second is to amplify, and the third is to adapt. You have
Mhm.
to constantly be working to enhance your culture. And a lot of folks want to stop after the first two rules. And there's a real temptation there because if you have a clear aspiration and you amplify it well, you will see movement. And you and I and all the leaders listening, we love to check things off. We love to get things done and move on to something else. But you can't ever stop working on culture. If you try to shrink wrap it to protect it, you'll suffocate it because it's a living, breathing thing. So you've always got to be working to enhance it. And so to enhance it, you've got several domains to consider. The first, and I think this was insinuated in your question, if you've got any critical gaps, you've got to move immediately to deal with those
Mm.
because there are any number of consequences, including the erosion of your leadership. Because if it's
Mm.
a critical gap, everybody knows it.
Yeah.
I was on a Zoom call last year with leadership from a Christian school, and we were talking. They want to talk about culture, and their aspiration, in short, was academic excellence, service to others, and leadership. Like, okay, we can work with that. We can talk about that. I mean, a lot of schools might say the same thing,
Yeah.
and so I've started to kind of shift gears into how they were amplifying those things. And somebody in the group stopped me and they said, now, as this conversation continues, let's not talk about leadership. I said, Okay, why would you ask me not to talk about leadership? And they said, well, we don't do anything with leadership. I said, wait a minute, is leadership one of your three pillars? They said, yeah. And I said, what do you mean you don't do anything with it? They said, we don't talk about it. We don't have a point of view. We don't teach it. And I said, is it on your website? Like on the first page? They went, well, yeah. And I said, okay, first action item from this meeting. Somebody's got to go take that off your website because you are destroying your credibility to publicly be espousing something that you're telling me, a stranger, that you don't even want to talk about it. So to me, that's the perfect example of a critical gap. If you got a critical gap, the leader's got to name it and say, we're going to work on this. Now,
Yeah.
you take it off the website, or maybe you say, we're going to make the website true.
Yeah.
And you begin,
What did they end up doing?
let your
Without
team do
revealing too much.
well, I gave them some food for thought. Let's put it that way.
In other words, they didn't do anything, but
First,
that's okay.
first is you got to close critical gaps. Number two is you need to eradicate any toxins, and
Mm,
toxins are patterns of unhealthy and unproductive attitudes and behavior.
mm,
If you've got those, because if you don't deal with them, they'll metastasize and they'll kill the organization. And
yeah,
so leaders, plural, but certainly the point leader has to be the primary champion of the culture and always vigilant to see, are there any toxins here?
yeah,
Uh, and again, the lengthy list of toxins. So let's assume an organization doesn't have any critical gaps and they've got no toxins that are at a level that require an intervention. Then I talk to leaders, go, so we can move on, right? Said, no, you got a couple more domains you can explore. One is, are there any strengths that you want to double down on?
mm,
Now, not just for fun, but to take those to a new level because it's often easier to build on a strength than to address a weakness.
yeah,
So if you can take that strength to a new level and sustain it, you've in fact enhanced the culture. Some of the Chick-fil-A restaurants have done that. We've been working on hospitality for 15 years, and most of the restaurants are pretty good at it. Well, some have said we want to turn that up a notch or
mm,
two and
mm,
and really enhance their culture as a result. Then
mm,
fourth and finally is adding new capabilities. And I know of a church that has done this quite well. The pastor, as I understand it, had this idea that we're not doing enough in the community, and
mm,
it's just not part of our culture. I mean, it's a growing, healthy church by most metrics, but he had this revelation or insight. And so he began to cast that vision, and that church is probably now known for that more than anything
mm.
else. He
Interesting.
changed the culture
Yeah,
by adding new capabilities
yeah, that's
to,
good.
to the congregation.
That's good.
Um, yeah, so I'm not sure that totally answered your question. At least it talks about the domains, but you ask about change, it's just going to require some heavy lifting. Um,
Yeah, and
and
I
we
think
got to stay with it.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, that's one of the main responsibilities of the leader is to be the gatekeeper for what you allow or don't allow when it comes to your culture that way. I think
Mhm.
Craig Rochelle constantly talks about it's what you promote and what you say no to or what you don't allow that essentially steers you towards where your culture is going to be and
Mhm.
exactly what you're saying. And I think that's, again, my responsibility as the leader or as the senior pastor. It'd be their responsibility to do that in each of their churches as well. Yeah.
Let me give you one word though. Yes, I agree with all that on the change point, and we have done a lot of work on this, including a global study. We're about $4 million into this project, and I don't
Mm.
know if we mentioned this or not, but I actually left Chick-fil-A.
Okay.
I had retired,
Okay.
sort of. I mean, I'm in my second half, and I'm going to try to
Okay.
run up the score. But this was a project we initiated several years ago that's not yet finished, and so we're
Mm,
still working, and there will ultimately be a book on the
mm,
topic. But if leaders want to understand maybe the insight that we've uncovered thus far as it relates to change, it's a concept we're calling dynamic awareness.
mm,
Um, and I know John Cotter, and most of your listeners would probably know that he wrote the book Change. He wrote it 40 years ago with his
yeah,
famous 8 step process. Um, and he did a new edition and he acknowledged the craziness of the world and said, "You guys need to do my 8 steps faster." With all due respect, I'm not sure that's how the world works anymore.
mm, mm.
I think we're past linear step one, step two, step three change. And so
Interesting.
what we're encouraging leaders to do is to develop this concept we're calling dynamic awareness. Is
Mm,
yes, all the usual elements still exist. You got to communicate, you got to provide support, and you got to do these things, but it's not linear. It's
yeah,
it's
okay,
you got to cast vision, you got to provide support, you got to provide energy, you got to iterate, you got to cast vision again, you got to support it again. And it's different in different teams and different parts of the business. And this part's going to need more support, and this part's going to
yeah.
need vision. And 6 months from now, you're going to have to try and experiment to change what's working over here and take and put it over here. And it's a
It's
much more
always happening. Yeah,
it's much more dynamic
yeah,
process. And so the leader's role is to be able to discern which of the driving elements of change needs to be in play in which facet of the organization.
yeah,
No longer a linear script. You cast
yeah.
vision to
That's good.
everybody, you provide training for everybody. It doesn't work that
That's
way.
good. That's
And
good.
so
I
leaders
as
have
you were
gotta keep their head on a swivel, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So as you were talking about John Cotter, I've got his book sitting here on my desk and been reviewing that. And I think you're right as far as his elements are there, but it's not happening one after another progressively. It's happening all the time. So yeah, I like that a lot. That's
So
great.
we're now trying to figure out how you teach dynamic awareness because you and
Mm,
I know leaders who do that they're unconsciously competent. We're
right.
actually saying, how do you teach somebody to see they need this over there and they need that over there and they need that again? We did that as opposed to saying, no, we already did step one. Like, no, we got
Yeah.
to go back.
Yeah.
And that's the stage where we are in that project. Is how do you teach somebody to do what you may do naturally? A lot of
Yeah.
leaders don't.
That'll be fun to see what you come up with because I mean, it feels like bottom line, you've got to know those basic steps. Then it becomes just intuitive to you, and then you notice which ones are out of line and you've got to gravitate towards. So, yeah,
Well, it's intuitive for the few.
because you've learned it. Yes.
Because the research that we've been able to uncover thus far is still 70% of organizational change efforts fail.
Hmm. Interesting.
And so if we can get that to 500, right? If we can get
Yeah,
half of them to work, we think that'd be a pretty good contribution to
that's good. That's
leadership
good.
world.
Hey, Mark, we've got just about 5 more minutes here, and I would love to ask you one other question, another area. Chick-fil-A is known for your creativity and for innovation, I guess I should say. And so, probably about 10 years ago, the executive team of LCBC had opportunity to go down and spend time with some of the leadership at Chick-fil-A for several days. And what I found fascinating, because I kept hearing outside of Chick-fil-A, innovation, innovation, and innovation is what Chick-fil-A is known for. And I think while we were there, and I could be wrong, and so feel free to correct me, but I think when we were there, they talked about an innovation that they were all excited about. And essentially, it was something where one of the operators had come up with a different way to fry French fries or something like that. It was just a real small thing, but they were celebrating that as this huge innovation. And what I find in church all the time, in church world, whether it's staff members or pastors, they always think innovation means they've got to come up with a whole new form or a different way of doing church, as opposed to what I think I learned at Chick-fil-A is it's more, it's iterations. It's not, we're going to throw out the chicken sandwich and we're going to start doing something totally different, but we're going to make the chicken sandwich better. And you keep innovating and iterating. Am I going down the right track that way? Because I think sometimes we get messed up on what innovation really is.
All right. So let me give you a really quick backstory. It's cool that you mentioned that because 15 years ago, Dan Cathy, our former CEO, said we need to be more innovative as a culture. Back to my example of adding new capabilities.
Yeah.
He said, based on the world we're moving into, we need to be more innovative. Now, we were no strangers to innovation. I mean, Truett invented the chicken sandwich, so we knew innovation. But if you looked at our history, it was a little bit random, a little bit sporadic, and it tended to come from certain pockets of the organization. And so we did what you would do to change a culture. We defined it, we funded it, we resourced it, we celebrated it. And now 15 years later, we're much more innovative than we were back then because a leader said, oh, we have a new core value around innovation
Yeah.
because a leader said, this is who we need to become for the future.
Yeah.
Now, to your question specifically, without splitting hairs, uh, innovation and continuous improvement are probably first cousins,
Yeah.
but tend to be different, and both are really good. But you'll have 100 instances of continuous improvement probably for every truly innovative idea.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate, and I would say often semantics and how you define those things. But to make something a tenth of a percent better is still continuous improvement. To make it 10% better is probably going to count as an innovation. So it's
Yeah. Yeah.
typically more of a magnitude, but both
Yeah.
are really good.
Yeah.
Um,
But
and
it's not so
when
much throwing out, let's not be
no,
a chicken sandwich place anymore. It's let's just get better at making chicken sandwiches or that kind of thing. And I think pastors think I've got to throw out the whole church model and start
yeah,
something totally new when that may not be the case.
no, but you may have some innovative things in the pipeline that are radically different
Yeah.
because you can only go so far with continuous improvement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Interesting.
I'm a huge fan of both.
Yeah, good. Very good. Mark, it's a lot of fun talking to you. We all know and love Chick-fil-A, but appreciate just the history that you have there and just the wealth of knowledge and information. Your new book, do you want to mention something about that at all? Uncommon Greatness, I think is the title.
Sure, it came out in March, and we're excited to have it out in the world. The 5 fundamentals of uncommon leaders, and so we're thankful to have it out there. It's the leadership model that Chick-fil-A, our team created 25, 28 years ago, and this is originally we published it as a parable. I co-authored that with Ken Blanchard. This is
Right.
a traditional leadership book with all of the stats and the best practices and tactics. And so none of that was present in that original book. So we're
Yeah.
thankful to
Okay.
have that out in the world.
Very good. Well, appreciate your contribution to just training, raising up leaders around the world. So thank you. And thank you for taking time with us today. I know the pastors will thoroughly enjoy hearing what you have to say and look forward to continuing to learn from you in the future. So, Mark, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.